So let's go back to one thing you've actually mentioned a couple of times. And this was one thing, actually, when I was crafting up interview questions, this is the first thing I wrote down because you talk about it so much on LinkedIn where I'm like, I need her to explain so much more about this because you changed my mindset around this actual tactic, by the way, where you mentioned about not just searching for the job title. And for me, of course, my world's instructional design. So naturally, before I was like, look up my instructional design jobs. But of course, as you mentioned, though, that you can pull 3 different job postings and all 3 are wildly different backgrounds, different requirements, different responsibilities. And you're like, oh, yeah. And I know that this can actually now in future thinking that this can actually hurt your job hunting process if you're just really looking so narrowly at something. So I'd love for you to explain more about what made you realize this to be able to say it's not just about the job title, but also how do you get around the fact that if you're looking for something as far as for like with LinkedIn Jobs or Glassdoor, Indeed, whatever you're using, you have to put in a title. So how do you get around that to be able to still see the jobs that you want to see?
Or do you?
Or do you? Like, I don't know. Tell me more about this.
Or do you, Luke? So it goes back to, we'll always say this goes back to finding your niche and getting really, really clear about what are the skills and the interests that you have that you want to utilize in your next role. And I always encourage you to have a list of at least 10, like really thinking about skills that you want to utilize and knowing how you want to utilize them. And some, you may not have the 100% picture, but like getting clear on like, all right, I have the skill of strategy, right? What does that look like in terms of how I want to use that skill in my next role? Or I have the skill of instructional design. It's remembering too that instructional design isn't just a field, but it's actually also a skill, right? So I have the skill of instructional design, but what does that look like for me in my next role? So having this list, I say 10 is a good place to start. Then what you can start to do is rather than searching for job titles, I love to use LinkedIn. It's my favorite search for jobs. Start to put in those skills. So you can use a Boolean search. And let's say, for example, you have strategy, instructional design, collaboration, let's say facilitation. Okay, let's say like those are like your top 4. You can then search and use a Boolean search inside of LinkedIn jobs, and all the roles that include instructional design, facilitation, strategy, and collaboration will come up for you. Now, it takes some time to do that. I will say the way I'm explaining it now is much easier said than done. It is something that I coach a lot on is like, how do we make sure we're looking for the right search terms and are they in alignment with your niche? And it takes time for the algorithm to catch up too. So give yourself some grace around that. But what will happen is it will start pulling up roles that have those search terms in them. And so you can start to go through and say, oh, here's this role that's called like instructional liaison, 49. And you're like, oh, that wouldn't have come up if I typed in instructional designer. But here it's talking about instructional design, collaboration, facilitation, some strategy, right? So it's really important to do that. I don't remember, I remember really early on with my first client, it was the aha moment for me because I was like, oh, I don't think, because like even though her title is instructional designer, that's not all she does. She wanted to be able to facilitate and do all of those things, but she was finding instructional designer roles that were like more back end, more, not human facing necessarily, not facilitation. And so I was like, I know for a fact there's worlds where that exists, but if we're just typing in instructional designer, we're not going to necessarily find that. And so I started typing in other words and realized, oh, a Boolean search, I didn't even know it was called that at first, but yeah, so I say don't type in titles at all. I tell my clients have 3 to 5 sets of 3 to 5 search terms and utilizing that, getting into a good habit. Eventually you'll probably narrow those down because you'll see, oh, every time I search for this one, I'm finding 1 or 2 roles, but they're also popping up in this one. So you'll start to see that. You can also do that with values to really start to understand the value piece of seeing what organizations exist out there that share those same values. Again, they may not have roles at this particular moment for you, but doing that to say, okay, for me, I value integrity and creativity and innovation. You could type those 3 into the job search in LinkedIn, and you can see which companies are coming up that are talking about those words often too. So you do not need to search by job title.
That's interesting.
In fact, I forbid it.
I've never thought about it like that way before. That's super interesting. Yeah. So from what you just said about we're talking about like the values, understanding about like culture, leadership, things of that nature, do you recommend people go to Glassdoor and look up the ratings of a company and then try to see what they have to offer that way? So you're kind of like reverse engineering it in a sorts to say like, oh, this place has been reviewed as like 5 out of 5 best place to work for. Hey, why don't you think about that? Like putting that inside of like making a mental note of if Google, whoever, if whoever is going to be doing something, you're like, oh, I should think more about them. Does that ever come up?
I think Glassdoor is helpful. I definitely always say take Glassdoor with a grain of salt because
Sure.
I do think it's kind of like Yelp in a sense, where like people are really quick to go in there and be like, this was the worst meal I ever had. But like a lot of people are like, oh, this is a great meal. And they're not like, oh, let me go on Yelp and put it on Yelp, right? So, although I've been told that like Gen Z doesn't use Yelp anymore, so maybe I'm dating myself. But I've been told it's not cool to use Yelp anymore. But you kind of get where I'm going there. And so I think Glassdoor, how I like to encourage my clients to use it, is if a role pops up for you, let's say you're on LinkedIn, a role pops up and you're like, oh, this role intrigues me. Like I always say too, like you don't have to feel the like butterflies immediately, right? It's like not a romantic comedy where we're looking across the dance floor and we're like, that's the job for me forever. It's like, we don't know that yet. That's not real life. But if it intrigues you enough, feels like it's in your niche, before applying, I think it's important to see, hey, is this a company that I would be, again, intrigued to work for? So that's usually when I would encourage people to go to Glassdoor. Again, it's a great site for understanding the reviews, but I really encourage you also to read the reviews and look for patterns, because when we think about, a lot of people are looking at it because they want to avoid working for a toxic organization. Mm-hmm. And so that's like the biggest fear. I don't want to work for a toxic organization. But the reality is like what's toxic for one person may not be toxic for another. So for me, when I look back at my last company, very toxic for me. Very, very, very toxic. But two of my best friends who are amazing and like love each other, still work there. And they don't find it toxic because while we have some similar values, what values they want to share in a company are different than the values that I want to share in a company. So for them, if they were to read my experience in a review, they may be like, okay, well, that's her experience, So I think it's important to really read through them as much as you can. And if you're starting to see patterns that don't align with your values, that's a good like red flag for you. But it might be some things that don't matter to you necessarily, right? Like maybe it's something that like, maybe they're talking about there not being a good, balance for mothers in the workplace. And maybe you don't want to be a mother or have any plans to be a mother. So that may not be a make or break for you necessarily, right? But for a mother, that could be a really toxic workplace to be in. So it's just one example of a million that could be out there. So yeah, I think it's a tool. I don't think it's like the gospel on if a company is good or not. But I think it's just one piece of data that you can take in for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know a lot of people, by the way, who still work within higher education because of the benefits package. That's why they're there. Salary is blah, but they're like, doesn't matter. I'm here for forever because of doing. It's like, okay, yeah, you gotta do what's best for you. So exactly. I get it.